Makes me feel a lot better.
The 10,206 meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is reports of the Secretary General on the Sudan and South Sudan. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Anita Kiki Ubeho, Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of the United Nations Mission in South Sudan. Major General George Agri Obinov, Interim Chairperson, Reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, and Ms. Lillian Rissick, Founder and President of the South Sudan Women's Empowerment Network. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its considerations of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Anita Kiki Ubeho. You have the floor. Very good. I give the floor to you, Ms. Ubeho, to begin your briefing. Welcome.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council on the situation in South Sudan. Since my last briefing in April, political discourse in South Sudan has increasingly been dominated by preparations for the December elections and by the challenges that the electoral process continues to raise. While elections represent an important transition milestone, concerns are growing about whether conditions necessary for credible, peaceful, and inclusive elections can be established in time. This concern must be viewed against the backdrop of the current interconnected and challenging environment, which has seen little improvement since my last brief. Politically, trust among key stakeholders remains fragile. Actions affecting the implementation of the revitalized peace agreement, together with the absence of key opposition actors from important processes, have raised concerns regarding inclusivity, consensus building, and confidence in the remaining transition process. Worth noting is the trial of Dr. Riek Machar has now exceeded 100 court days and continued for almost 1 year, during which time has remained in detention. From a security perspective, we remain deeply concerned by ongoing armed confrontations involving the SSPDF and the SPLA-IO, particularly in Jonglei, as well as ongoing tensions in other parts of the country. We are also concerned by the cycle of communal violence in places such as Warab and Lake State. Civilians continue to pay the highest price, facing displacement, losing lives, homes, and livelihoods as a result of insecurity. The humanitarian situation remains extremely concerning. From January to June, violence displaced more than 420,000 people, primarily in Jonglei. These displacements compound an already severe crisis characterized by food insecurity and increasingly constrained humanitarian access. South Sudan also hosts approximately 1.4 million people fleeing the conflict in Sudan, placing additional pressure on national capacities and humanitarian services. Disease outbreaks continue to generate additional strain on already fragile systems. Cholera remains a serious concern, while the threat posed by Ebola in the neighboring DRC requires sustained vigilance and preparedness. Humanitarian personnel themselves are facing growing danger. This year alone, 36 humanitarian workers have been killed and 391 access incidents recorded, representing a significant increase over the same period last year. Against this backdrop, it is important to recognize that the broader operating environment has not improved significantly. In summary, the political, security, humanitarian, and economic constraints that have shaped the transition over recent years largely remain in place, and the political environment remains fragmented. Concerning elections, important questions remain to be addressed regarding the political, security, and institutional conditions necessary for credible, peaceful, and inclusive elections. Specifically, questions persist regarding political trust, civic and political space, security arrangements, financing, constituency boundaries, and broader institutional preparedness. Communities continue to experience violence and displacement, while humanitarian needs remain among the highest in the region. These realities continue to affect both the implementation of the peace agreement and preparations for elections. At the same time, there are important developments to be noted which should be built upon. First, the government's announcement of a commitment stating it would not engage in renewed hostilities remains an important confidence-building measure. However, it must be anchored in the 2017 cessation of hostilities agreement to be fully implemented and translated into reductions in violence on the ground by all parties. Second, despite facing enormous economic and humanitarian pressures, South Sudan has continued to keep its borders open to those fleeing the conflict in Sudan. This policy has provided protection and refuge to large numbers of vulnerable people and merits international support. Madam President, allow me to now briefly turn to UNMISS. The mission is implementing its revised mandate in this challenging environment, focused on the priorities established by the Council: protecting civilians, facilitating humanitarian assistance, supporting implementation of the peace process through our good offices, and promoting and protecting human rights. Despite mounting challenges, including resources, our focus remains firmly on the people of South Sudan. We have maintained a protective presence in conflict-affected areas, conducted patrols in locations such as Warrap and Jonglai, despite access challenges, and retained our presence in locations such as Akobo and Abienom to support civilian protection and facilitate humanitarian access during periods of heightened insecurity. Politically, we have intensified engagement with national leaders, regional organizations, neighboring states, and international partners to encourage consensus around a viable pathway for concluding the transition. UNMISS continues to support the efforts of the African Union High Representative, former President Jakaya Kikwete, to foster inclusive dialogue and advance the peace process. Together with the AU, IGAD, RJMAC, and other partners, we continue to advocate for dialogue, confidence-building measures, and a reduction in violence. At the same time, persistent insecurity, humanitarian pressures, and political tensions require constant adaptation. To remain fit for purpose, UNMISS is reviewing its structures, activities, staffing profile, and operational posture, while strengthening early warning, mobility, and responsiveness to emerging threats. Madam President, South Sudan already possesses a framework for completing its transition peacefully through the revitalized peace agreement. A central challenge remains meaningful implementation. What is required is the political will by all South Sudanese leaders to implement commitments already undertaken. Allow me, therefore, to conclude with 4 messages. First, the fighting must stop. Continued violence threatens civilians, undermines confidence, and weakens prospects for a peaceful transition. All parties must refrain from actions that escalate tensions or undermine confidence. Second, civilians and humanitarian personnel must be protected and humanitarian access must parties, civil society, faith-based actors, women, youth, and other stakeholders must be heard. Inclusive dialogue is also a necessary condition if elections are to contribute to peace and stability. Elections, if managed well, can become a path towards peace rather than a trigger for increased tensions. Fourth, there is a need for an objective and realistic assessment of the minimum conditions necessary for credible elections. As such, we welcome the proposed upcoming African Union Needs Assessment Mission. Such an assessment should be accompanied by collective efforts to address the outstanding political, security, and institutional requirements identified by South Sudanese stakeholders and regional partners. South Sudan faces significant risks, but it also retains a genuine opportunity to change course. The situation remains serious, but it is not beyond remedy. Clear, consistent, and unified action from this Council in support of these priorities would help create political space for compromise, reinforce regional initiatives, and encourage South Sudan's leaders to choose consensus over confrontation. Through a cessation of hostilities, inclusive political dialogue, and renewed commitment to implementing existing agreements, this moment can still become a turning point toward the ultimate objective, peace. The people of South Sudan have endured extraordinary hardship. They deserve a transition that is inclusive, credible, and capable of delivering the peaceful and stable South Sudan for which they have waited for so long. I thank you.
I thank the SRSG for her briefing. I now give the floor to Major General George Aggrey Awinav. You have the floor, sir.
And representative. Okay, can you hear me?
Hear you.
Thank you. Excellency Ambassador Christina Lansen, the permanent representative of Denmark to the United Nations and the President of the United Nations Security Council, distinguished members of the Council, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Madam President, at the outset, let me begin by congratulating you on your assumption of the presidency of the Security Council for this month of August. May I also take this opportunity to thank this Council for inviting the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, abbreviated as RJMEC, to address this esteemed Council on the status of implementation of the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan, commonly referred to as the R-axis. As you may all be aware, RJMEC is established under Chapter 7 of the 2018 Revitalized Peace Agreement on the resolution of the conflict on the Republic of South Sudan as the oversight body responsible for monitoring, evaluating, and overseeing its status of implementation. The Commission's mandate includes, among others, submission of regular status of the implementation reports to inter alia the United Nations Security Council every 3 months and followed by a detailed briefing such as this one. My briefing today, therefore, builds on my last briefing of the 10th February 2026 to this Council and will therefore highlight only the recent developments and critical issues as contained in RJMEC's latest quarterly report covering the period of 1st April to 30th June of 2026. Madam President, esteemed Council members, regarding the status of implementation of the revitalized peace agreement, overall progress has been significantly constrained by the persistent political and security challenges that has endured since March 2025 amidst a challenging humanitarian and economic environment. The aforementioned impasse, characterized by diminished inclusivity in the transition government of national unity and repeated violations of the permanent ceasefire and disruptions of activities of agreements implementation institutions and mechanisms that has eroded trust among the parties to the revitalized peace agreement and adversely affected those relating to governance and security that undermine confidence in the peace process. On the country's readiness for the 22nd December 2026 polls, as announced by the National Elections Commission, barely 5 months away, preparations are ongoing, albeit way behind schedule. Recently, the Commission launched nationwide civic and voter education campaigns, having received some additional funding for those activities. The Political Parties Council set 30th June 2026 as the deadline for political parties intending to participate in the 2026 elections to register, and as a result, 39 political parties have since been declared fully registered. In spite of these milestones, RJMEC observes that critical prerequisites for the conduct of credible, peaceful, and inclusive elections remain uncertain, necessitating the need to urgently galvanize a political consensus through an inclusive and genuine dialogue. Urgent decisions will need to be made on key outstanding legal and political questions, modalities for expediting the completion of the unification of the forces, guaranteeing civic and political space, provision of predictable and adequate logistical and financial resources to implementing institutions and mechanisms, insecurity in several parts of the country, including addressing the challenges of civilian displacement. Meanwhile, the security situation in South Sudan remains fragile as sporadic clashes continue to be reported between rival forces affiliated with the parties, especially the government South Sudan People's Defense Forces and the opposition's South Sudan People's Liberation Army in opposition, and their allies, as well as some holdout groups in areas of Upper Nile, Jonglei, Unity, and parts of Equatoria. Overall, implementation of the permanent ceasefire is partial and inconsistent as key security mechanisms remain non-operational. Furthermore, the second phase of the unification of forces, security sector reform, and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, that is DDR, processes have all stalled. The humanitarian situation in the country continues to deteriorate as a result of renewed violence, internal displacement, food insecurity, restrictions on humanitarian access, population movements, and inadequate basic services. These continue to negatively impact the participation of the affected populations, particularly women, youth, and persons living with disabilities in socio-political and civic processes. Progress on gender provisions remains limited, with women's representation continuing to fall below the minimum 35% threshold provided for in the R-axis. Women's participation and inclusion in social, political, and civic processes continue to be constrained by the combined effects of unilateral replacements of female appointees with male counterparts, insecurity, displacement, humanitarian challenges, weak protection systems, structural gender inequalities, and delays in the enactment of the gender-responsive legislation. On a positive note, however, some progress was recorded in public financial management, reforms, and economic governance. Oil production remained above 170,000 barrels per day, and measures are in place to improve transparency and oversight in oil revenue management. Progress was also made towards appointing the commissioner for the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation, and Healing, the CTRH. However, the establishment of the Compensation and Reparation Authority, CRA, and the Hybrid Court for South Sudan are still both pending. Further progress has been made in the permanent constitution-making process, with the National Constitution Review Commission completing civic education and public consultations in all the 10 states and the 3 administrative areas. In response to the ongoing political and security impasse, RGMEC continues to undertake high-level engagements with the parties, the agreement, the Transitional Government of National Unity, implementing institutions and mechanisms, regional guarantors, the African Union, IGAD, international partners, and other peace stakeholders. The Commission is also working closely with the recently appointed the African Union High Representative to the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea, His Excellency Jakaya Kikwete, the former President of the United Republic of Tanzania and Regional Special Envoys, to explore pathways for resolving the ongoing political and security impasse, which demands an inclusive political dialogue consistent with the recent AU C5+ declaration and subsequent decisions of the African Union Peace and Security Council. Madam President, in light of these developments, RGMEC wishes to make the following recommendations to this August Council. First, continue supporting full implementation of the R-axis as the only viable framework for lasting peace in South Sudan, and encourage all the parties and stakeholders to uphold and adhere to the full implementation in letter and spirit. Secondly, support implementation of the AU C5+ declaration and all previous United Nations Security Council recommendations by working closely with the African Union, with IGAD, RGMEC, and the parties to facilitate an all-inclusive South Sudanese political dialogue. Also urge the parties to de-escalate tensions, cease hostilities, release political detainees, and to adhere to the R-axis. Call upon all parties, holder groups, and stakeholders to engage in genuine and inclusive dialogue to build consensus on the roadmap towards completion of the transition and the conduct of peaceful, credible, and inclusive elections. Appeal to this Council members to enhance political, technical, and logistical support to the electoral institutions, particularly the National Elections Commission, the Political Parties Council, the National Constitution Review Commission, to expedite the completion of their tasks before the end of the transition period. And finally, strengthen support coexistence. Madam President, RJMEC remains concerned about the danger posed to regional and international peace with the potential collapse of the R-axis and the relapse to violence in South Sudan if urgent, firm, and decisive steps are not taken to unlock the status quo and parties to commit to the peace agreement. In this regard, RJMEC reiterates its appeal to this esteemed Council to consider dispatching a confidence-building mission to Juba to engage the parties and all stakeholders and guide on an appropriate way forward towards a peaceful and democratic conclusion of the transition period. RJMEC further urges this Council to remain seized with the peace process in South Sudan at this very critical moment that, if handled well, will see South Sudan emerge from a long crisis period to a peaceful, stable,
Thank Major General Awina for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Lilian Rizek.
conflict, insecurity, and impunity. Nearly 4 years later, I regret to report that many of those concerns remain unresolved. Repeated extensions of political transition and climate-related shocks and disease. At least 1/3 lifetime, many before the age of 18. The Najero Army Barracks in Western Equatoria State in November 2025. Humanitarian responders, human rights defenders, and mediators. Yet, they remain underrepresented in political institutions and peace processes, despite national and international commitments to women participation. South Sudanese women are not requesting that the international community resolve their challenges. Rather, they seek partnership in ensuring that commitments already made are effectively implemented. The protection of women and girls cannot be separated from South Sudan's broader political transition. With elections planned for December 2026, significant challenges remain, including weak institutions, insecurity, limited political consensus, lack of civic space, and unfinished transition. Madam President, when this council next convenes to review the situation in South Sudan, it should be able to report measurable progress, not missed opportunities. Achieving such progress requires sustained and coordinated action. Chapter 5 of the Revitalize Agreement. Third, ensure the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of South Sudanese women and women civil society organizations in the constitution-making process, transitional justice, and all political decision-making. The rule of law, political inclusion, and justice for survivors.
with killings and sexual violence rising sharply amid ongoing armed conflict. One mother in Western Equatoria State lamented that our children are dying like flowers falling. We need real peace. Her words reflect a broader reality. Between April and July alone, UNMISS documented 418 people killed, 400 injured, 122 people abducted, and more than 420,000 government-imposed movement restrictions on UNMISS patrols. Despite that, continues today. Vast public resources go unused for public. And the violence, to encourage direct dialogue between all signatory parties and to cease all obstructions and non-cooperation with UNMISS. This council must insist South Sudan's leaders honor these commitments and choose dialogue for peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative.
Outbreak is rendering the situation yet more complex. The convergence of these factors is heightening the risk of an even more critical scenario. With the election scheduled for December only a few months away, Colombia notes with concern that the revitalized agreement has yet to be implemented in its entirety. Unilateral amendments there too are stoking mistrust between stakeholders and shrinking the likelihood of stabilization. Dialogue, mutual recognition by the parties, and the full implementation of the agreement must guide the journey towards peace. The current crisis spill over into the post-electoral period and stoke conditions for instability and long-term violence. In light of the above, Colombia welcomes the efforts that are seeking to oil the wheels of political dialogue, particularly the renewed regional commitment of actors such as the African Union and the good offices of the African Union High Representative for the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea, Jakaya Kikwete. No effort is too small or superfluous to requirements when peace is at stake. Madam President, my delegation recognises the work that has been requires a state committed to guaranteeing its access, its safety, and its capacity to operate. In terms of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, I wish to underscore the work that UNMISS is doing on two fronts. First, accountability and fighting impunity must remain priorities for the international community and for national authorities. To conclude, Madam President, Colombia encourages a focus on consensus building. We appeal to all parties to get political talks back on track, to
and head of UNMISS, Ms. Ibejo, and interim chairperson of the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, Major General Onyewu, for their comprehensive briefing. And we also thank Ms. Lillian Razak for her testimony. We also welcome the participation of the representative of South Sudan in today's meeting. Madam President, the A3 reaffirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and unity of South Sudan, and reiterates that the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan remains the sole agreed framework for advancing the country's political transition, inclusive dialogue, and achieving sustainable peace. The briefing received this morning and the Secretary General's report highlight that South Sudan is entering a critical phase of its transition. of the agreement. Madam President, the A3 remains deeply concerned the spillover effects of the conflict in neighboring Sudan, climate-related shocks, and significant humanitarian funding gaps. The A3 is equally concerned by the continued reports of human rights violations, including conflict-related sexual violence, recruitment of children, arbitrary detention and restriction indispensable to durable peace in South Sudan. The A3 reiterates any adjustment to the mission's presence should continue to take into account conditions on the ground steadfast in supporting the people and the government of South Sudan in realizing the aspirations of lasting peace, stability, and sustainable development. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
The following 4 points. First, the revitalized agreement remains the only viable and We are deeply concerned by the continued fighting in Jonglei, Upper Nile, and other parts of the country. Pakistan will continue to support UNMISS and all efforts aimed at advancing lasting peace.
We are closely monitoring the situation in the country, which unfortunately is far from being stable. Clear evidence of this is the growing number of armed incidents in recent months in the northern regions of the country, including Jonglei and Greater Equatoria. We are firmly convinced that it is not possible to achieve a solution to the South Sudanese conflict through the use of force. We hope that the authorities and the opposition forces will henceforth show political foresight, will be able to find common ground, and will stop the impending escalation. If not, the situation could lead to a spiral of violence and a resumption of large-scale armed conflict. We are concerned by the dire humanitarian situation in South Sudan. Instability on the ground is disrupting normal life in areas affected by clashes. The local population is being forced to leave their homes, and that is a reason for the ongoing rise in casualties, including civilian casualties. The situation is complicated by seasonal natural disasters, as well as the influx of hundreds of thousands of refugees and South Sudanese returning home from neighboring Sudan. A firm foundation for moving forward with the peace process continues to be the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in the Republic. We are pleased to note that the South Sudanese leadership continues to adhere to this logic. In this regard, we welcome the announcement by the National Elections Commission of South Sudan of a specific date for the upcoming elections, the 22nd of December 2026, and the beginning of preparations for those elections. We call upon all leading political forces in the country to participate in this expression of the will of the people. Questions about the timeframes of the various aspects of the agreement, we believe, should be left at the discretion of Juba. The country desperately needs practical assistance and not just criticism, particularly in light of the economic problems that are building up in the country. In this regard, it is hard to overlook the importance of outside efforts aimed at achieving a peaceful resolution to the current military and political crisis in South Sudan. We highly appreciate the constructive mediation of the African Union. We welcome the recent visits to the country of delegations from the African Union Peace and Security Council, as well as the High Representative for the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea, Jakaya Kikwete. We also note the active position of IGAD. We hope that these efforts will bear fruit. The tense situation in South Sudan is a problem for the entire sub-region. It's most important that this does not become a source of widespread destabilization, given porous borders, the easy movement of fighters, and the rise in the illicit trade in arms. It is necessary to prevent attempts to use the territory of South Sudan as a foothold for supporting the parties to the conflict in Sudan. We are convinced that the young republic needs unified, viable, and effective armed forces that can ensure order, and incidentally, that is written clearly in the revitalized peace agreement. In that regard, we would once again like to draw attention to the harmfulness of maintaining the arms embargo in respect of South Sudan, because that is the main barrier to forming and outfitting the army. And revising or lifting the sanctions regime is something many players on the African continent are in favor of. It should be clear to everyone that the existing exemptions are not enough to solve the significant undertaking of strengthening national security. We consistently call for it to be eased or fully dismantled. An important component of moving the country towards peace is the work of the UN mission in South Sudan, and we support the work of the head of the mission, Ms. Gbeho. We firmly condemn any acts of violence targeting blue helmets, representatives of humanitarian organizations, and the civilian population. We trust that despite the existing financial difficulties, UNMISS will continue to effectively support the implementation of the agreement. For our part, we will continue to provide comprehensive support to that end. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Thank you, Madam President. And I thank SRSG Anita Kiki-Beho, interim chairperson of RJMEC, Major General George Aggrey Owino, and Ms. Lillian Rizik for their valuable briefings. As we heard today, the situation in South Sudan remains alarming, with multiple risks increasingly reinforcing one another. Reversing this trajectory requires renewed political commitment and urgent coordinated action. And I will make 3 points. First, we call for an immediate and sustained cessation of hostilities. The revitalized agreement remains the only agreed framework for completing the transition. All parties should uphold it and resolve their differences through its established mechanisms. We are concerned that amendments to the agreement were ratified without the required consent of RJMEC's voting members and without the participation of several key signatories. Bypassing agreed procedures further erodes trust and hampers the transition. We take note of the intention to hold elections on 22nd December 2026. Time is increasingly limited, yet critical questions remain unresolved. And we urge the authorities to engage in a genuine and inclusive high-level dialogue, rebuild consensus, and agree on the safeguards needed to ensure peaceful, inclusive, free and fair elections. We also call for the release of the first Vice President, Riek Machar, and other political detainees as an urgent confidence-building measure. Addressing these gaps is essential to prevent violence before, during, and after the elections. Second, South Sudanese women and girls bear the brunt of the ongoing hostilities. Conflict-related sexual violence continues to be used as tactics of war. Latvia condemns all acts of conflict-related sexual violence and other forms of gender-based violence. All parties must respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Allegations must be investigated, perpetrators held accountable, and survivors provided with survivor-centered support and access to justice. It is also more important than ever to create an enabling environment in which women can shape South Sudan's future. Central to these efforts is the full implementation of the 35% quota across all institutions established under the agreement and throughout the electoral process. We welcome the establishment of the Cross-Party Women's Forum and the adoption of its declaration. And the priority now is to translate this step into concrete action. Third, the humanitarian emergency continues to deepen amid ongoing conflict and violations of international humanitarian law. More than half of the population faces acute food insecurity. Between April and July, 26 humanitarian personnel and contractors were killed, while relief operations continue to face obstruction and access denials. Deliberate attacks against humanitarian personnel may constitute war crimes. Such attacks must be investigated and those responsible held accountable. We must also prepare for the effects of a strengthening El Niño. Dry and warmer conditions across much of South Sudan have already damaged agriculture and livelihoods and further increased humanitarian needs. In the run-up to the elections, growing pressure on land and water could aggravate local tensions and in turn heighten broader risks to peace and security. Madam President, UNMISS must retain the capabilities and access required to protect civilians, support early warning and facilitate humanitarian assistance. As the mission adopts a more mobile and regionally focused operating model, it should, where possible, make greater use of modern technologies. Repeated violations of the Status of Forces Agreement and restrictions of movement must end. Finally, Latvia expresses its full support to UNMISS, but it is South Sudan's leaders who bear the primary responsibility for the country's future. In the critical months ahead, close and constructive cooperation with the United Nations, the African Union, and other regional partners will be essential. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for the statement, and then I'll give the floor to the representative of Bahrain.
Madam President, we thank Madam Anita Kekek-Behu, Special Representative of the SG for South Sudan and Head of UNMISS, Major General George Agre Owinow, Interim Chair of the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, as well as Madam Lillian Rizk, Founder and Representative of the South Sudan Women's Empowerment Network, for their valuable briefings, and we welcome the participation of the Republic of South Sudan to our meeting today. In light of the report of the Secretary General and the briefings we heard today, we wish to stress the following. First and foremost, we underline the importance of continuously building on current preparations in South Sudan to hold credible and successful elections late this year. We stress the importance of collective action by the parties to uphold their commitments provided for in the 2018 revitalized peace agreement, to pave the way for strengthened stability and to consolidate the transition process in the country. In the same vein, we commend the important role undertaken by UNMISS through its engagement with all parties, including women and youth, to support the convening of elections. The Kingdom of Bahrain is cognizant of current challenges. However, we stress that their resolution primarily rests on strengthened cooperation, mutual confidence among the parties, and an inclusive political process through constructive dialogue. Second, the Kingdom of Bahrain welcomes efforts undertaken by the African Union and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, as well as their respective mechanisms. We commend the efforts made by the high-level representative of the AU for the Horn of Africa region, and we encourage further integration and coordination amongst these efforts and United Nations initiatives to consolidate momentum and ensure an effective response to the situation in South Sudan. Third, we join the international community in expressing our concern over the humanitarian situation in South Sudan due to ongoing hostilities and multiple health and economic crises, as well as the spread of cholera, the threat posed by Ebola, and displacement-related challenges. Madam President, we reiterate the Secretary General's call to galvanize efforts to build confidence and resume dialogue to prevent a political escalation which may exacerbate instability and worsen humanitarian needs. We reiterate our call for the provision of urgent and unhindered humanitarian assistance, the protection of peacekeeping forces and humanitarian and relief staff to ensure that they fulfill their duties and respond to the current needs, namely in high-risk counties. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Bahrain for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We are grateful for the briefings given by Ms. Anita Kiki Gabejo, Special Representative of the Secretary General for South Sudan and Head of the United Nations Mission in South Sudan, and Major General George Agre Owinau, Interim Chairperson of the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission. We also recognize the presence here today of the representative of South Sudan. We're also grateful to Ms. Lillian Rizik, founder and president of the South Sudan Women's Empowerment Network. She is here in the chamber representing civil society. We're grateful to all briefers for sharing their invaluable assessments of the situation in South Sudan. We take note of the most recent report of the Secretary General. Its message is clear. The next few months will be crucial in determining the fate of the political transition in South Sudan. They will decide whether instead of a political transition, we see greater instability and violence. We are deeply concerned by the worsening of the security situation across several regions of the country. Ongoing clashes between the parties, the uptick in intercommunal violence, and the spread of hostilities continue to produce civilian victims, displacement, and the destruction of critical infrastructure. Moreover, we are concerned, or rather we note with outrage, the continued restriction on UNMISS freedom of movement and the violations of the status of forces agreements. These continue to stymie the mission's ability to protect the civilian population and to discharge its mandate in full. Moreover, we are seeing a worrying political impasse. The implementation of the revitalized agreement continues to be delayed as deep divisions remain between political actors. The dismantling of the opposition in breach of the peace agreement, unilateral amendments thereto, and the lack of progress on core provisions of the agreement continue to undermine trust between the parties and continue to erode the credibility of the peace process. The decision to hold general elections in December is a crucial milestone in terms of the country's future. However, significant challenges remain in terms of institutional preparedness, the legal framework, financing, security, and the creation of an enabling political and civic environment. Consequently, we wish to state that the holding of national elections should strengthen the peace process and not replace it. With this in mind, Panama reaffirms that the revitalized agreement continues to stand as the most viable political framework. We urge the parties to act in good faith and to make full use of the mechanisms provided for in the agreement to resolve their differences. They should also adopt confidence-building measures and resume an inclusive political dialogue which preserves the integrity of the transition process. President, the humanitarian situation in South Sudan continues to worsen. Millions of people are facing severe food insecurity, humanitarian access continues to worsen, and the country continues to face a dire cholera epidemic. We have also noted the worsening of the human rights situation. We continue to receive reports of extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detentions, conflict-related sexual violence, and the erosion of civic space, in a context in which impunity remains one of the primary drivers of violence. We reiterate that all parties must fully respect international humanitarian law. They must protect the civilian population and guarantee safe, rapid, sustained, and unfettered humanitarian access. Madam President, this morning, together with other Council members, Panama participated in a joint statement issued by signatories to the WPS shared commitments. We reiterated that there can be no lasting peace without the full, equal, meaningful and safe participation of women. In this connection, we are concerned by the fact that women and girls continue to face alarming levels of sexual and gender-based violence. Moreover, we unequivocally oppose the intimidation and harassment of women human rights defenders and for peace building. Against this backdrop, we reiterate our firm support for UNMISS's mandate and in particular for its protection of civilians work as well as its work to monitor human rights and to promote the WPS agenda. Moreover, Panama recognizes the important role played by the African Union, the Intergovernmental Authority, IGAD, and we welcome the meeting held yesterday in the AUPSC. That was a meeting on South Sudan. We value the aforementioned efforts to keep channels for dialogue open and to support the implementation of the revitalized agreement. A coordinated regional response will remain crucial in order to preserve prospects for peace. To conclude, today more than ever before, it is incumbent upon South Sudanese leaders to demonstrate the necessary political commitment to preserve the progress made since 2018. The South Sudanese people deserve a peaceful transition, legitimate institutions, and a future built on dialogue and not on violence. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, I would like to thank SRSG Gabeho and Interim Chairperson Owino for their briefings. I've listened carefully to Ms. Lilian Rizik. I welcome the Deputy Permanent Representative of South Sudan to today's meeting. Recently, the South Sudan National Elections Commission officially announced that general elections will be held at the end of this year, marking a critical stage in the country's transition process. To accompany this youngest nation in the world to make a steady progress along the path of peace and development, I have 4 points to make. First, maintaining national stability is a fundamental prerequisite. While the security situation in South Sudan has generally been stable recently, incidents such as localized conflicts and intertribal violence continue to occur. China commends the South Sudan People's Defense Forces for their unilateral declaration of cessation of hostilities and calls on all parties to remain calm, exercise restraint, and avoid resorting to force in order to prevent the situation from escalating. Protection of the civilians and humanitarian workers is a red line under the international humanitarian law, and all parties have an obligation to uphold it. We support the government of South Sudan and UNMISS in continuing to promote intercommunal dialogue and implementing more confidence-building measures to foster harmony, unity, and mutual assistance among the people. Second, building political consensus is the only way forward. China calls on all political parties in South Sudan to act in the overall interests of the country and the fundamental well-being of its people, to uphold and implement in good faith the revitalization agreement and to properly address differences and build consensus through inclusive dialogue. China welcomes the regional mediator efforts led by the AU High-Level Ad Hoc Committee on South Sudan and High Representative Kikwete. We encourage the UN to play its role through the tripartite mechanism and support the approach of African solutions to African problems. The international community should, on the basis of respecting South Sudan's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, play a more constructive role in promoting peace and stability and assisting the South Sudanese people. Timely adjust or lift sanctions on the country while refraining from undue interference or pressure. Third, improving the economy and people's livelihood is an effective means of support. South Sudan faces multiple internal and external crises, including displacement, food insecurity, flooding, and outbreak of diseases. The international community should provide more development and humanitarian assistance to help South Sudan improve infrastructure, promote economic diversification, enhance people's well-being in areas such as education, healthcare, and employment, and strengthen South Sudan's resilience to risks while enhancing its endogenous development momentum. Recently, China provided a new batch of emergency food aid to South Sudan, and the project, supported by China in air traffic management system, officially launched its operations. We will continue to provide assistance to the best of our ability. Fourth, supporting UNMISS in fulfilling its mandate is a crucial safeguard. The Secretary General report clearly points out that reductions to UNMISS's budget and the scope of operations have severely impacted the humanitarian operations and the security environment. China once again expresses its regret over the Council's resolution reducing UNMISS's mandate and size, and supports the Secretary General and the Force Commander in conducting a thorough assessment of military and police capabilities to ensure the mission has the necessary resources to carry out its duties. As a permanent member of the Security Council and a major TCC to UNMISS, China will, as always, support the work of SRSG Gebeho and support UNMISS in strengthening cooperation with the government and play a greater role in promoting peace, security, and stability in South Sudan. Madam President, South Sudan has just celebrated its 15th anniversary of independence. China extends its heartfelt congratulations to the country on what it has accomplished in terms of the peace process, nation building, and economic development. As a good friend to the country, China is willing to join the international community in firmly supporting the efforts of the government and the people of South Sudan to achieve national reconciliation and lasting peace, and will continue to play a constructive role towards this end. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank SRSG Anita Kiki Beho for her briefing, Major General Owino, and the representative of civil society, Ms. Risik, for their valuable insights. The political, security, and humanitarian situation in South Sudan continues to deteriorate at an alarming pace, with serious implications for regional stability and the prospects for a sustainable peace process. Despite sustained regional and international engagement, the implementation of key provisions of the revitalized peace agreement remains seriously behind schedule, while political tensions and insecurity continue to undermine the country's fragile transition and heighten the risk of a relapse into a wider conflict. Madam President, allow me to highlight 3 key points. First, the political situation remains fragile and increasingly uncertain. We are concerned by the continued unilateral amendments to the revitalized peace agreement and the persistent lack of political consensus among the parties. At the same time, progress on constitutional reforms, security sector reform, and transitional justice mechanisms remain limited. The government has reiterated its intention to hold general elections on the 22nd of December. However, the necessary conditions for credible, peaceful, and inclusive elections, such as a conducive political environment, adequate preparation, and the meaningful participation of all stakeholders, are still absent. We therefore echo the Secretary General's call for all parties to engage in a genuine dialogue and rebuild trust. We are also concerned by the continued detention of First Vice President Riek Machar and other political figures. Such developments risk further exacerbating tensions, undermine confidence among the parties, and complicate efforts to advance an inclusive political process. Second, the security situation has continued to deteriorate across several parts of the country, notably the greater Upper Nile, as well as the provinces of Jonglei, Unity, Central Equatoria, and Warab, which remain among the areas most severely affected. Clashes between the parties to the peace agreement and their allied forces, aerial bombardments, and intercommunal violence continue to exact an unbearable toll on civilians. We condemn, in the strongest terms, all acts of conflict-related sexual violence and call for accountability for perpetrators and timely access of survivors to comprehensive survivor-centered services. We are deeply alarmed by UNMISS reporting of a sharp increase in conflict-related sexual violence during the first quarter of 2026. We are particularly alarmed by the continued violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. All perpetrators of such violations must be held accountable. The protection of civilians, particularly women and children, must remain at the center of all national and international efforts. We are especially concerned by the continued grave violations committed against children, including their recruitment and use by armed actors, as well as the killing and maiming of children. Greece calls on all parties to end all grave violations against children, fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and ensure the safe and sustainable reintegration of children formerly associated with armed forces and armed groups. Third, the humanitarian situation remains equally dire. More than 420,000 people have been newly displaced since the beginning of the year, nearly 60% of them women and girls. The health system remains under severe strain, while disease outbreaks, including cholera and polio, continue to exacerbate humanitarian needs. Attacks against humanitarian personnel and restrictions on humanitarian access continue to impede the safe, rapid, and unimpeded delivery of life-saving assistance to those most in need and must cease immediately. In this regard, Greece reiterates its full support for UNMISS and its indispensable role in protecting civilians, facilitating dialogue and supporting the peace process. We remain concerned by persistent restrictions on the mission's freedom of movement and other impediments to the implementation of its mandate, and call on all parties to comply fully with the Status of Forces Agreement to enable UNMISS to implement its mandate effectively. Madam President, we reaffirm that the South Sudanese-owned, inclusive, and credible political process remains the only viable path towards a lasting peace and stability. We welcome, in this respect, the continued regional engagement, particularly by the African Union and IGAD, in support of an inclusive peace and political process. In conclusion, we call on all South Sudanese stakeholders to demonstrate political will, cease hostilities, uphold the ceasefire, fully implement the revitalized peace agreement, and re-engage in a meaningful and inclusive dialogue, placing the interests of the South Sudanese people at the center of their efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, first of all, I would like to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Ms. Anita Kiki-Beho, as well as Mr. George Owino and Ms. Lilian Rizik for their briefings. I would like to address 3 points. First, France reiterates its full support for UNMISS and the UN Special Representative. This operation is essential to help stabilize the country, and it must be able to operate at full capacity in order to implement its mandate. France deplores the many impediments to the activities and freedom of movement of UN staff. The Status of Forces Agreement must be fully respected. France calls upon the South Sudanese transition government to fully cooperate with the United Nations. Second, we note a further deterioration in the security and humanitarian situation, as underscored in the report of the Secretary General. Clashes between the South Sudanese People's Defense Forces, the parties to the 2018 Revitalized Peace Agreement, and other armed actors are ongoing. Inter-community violence continues, once again causing large numbers of civilian casualties. Faced with the persistence of one of the most serious humanitarian crises in the world, France commends the essential and brave work of humanitarian staff. France condemns the violence against them in South Sudan and pays tribute to the memory of the 30 humanitarian workers that died this year in the line of duty, 8 of whom died in June alone. We also denounce the use of conflict-related sexual violence as a weapon of war, as well as all sexual and gender-based violence. Third, the political situation in the country remains tense and precarious. We note that the calls from the African Union to lift proceedings against persons detained for political reasons, including First Vice President Riek Machar, have not been heeded. And we once again call upon the South Sudanese authorities to follow up on this. Madam President, the 2018 peace agreement continues to be the basis of the transition government's legitimacy. We regret measures aimed at amending the peace agreement without the consensus of all signatory parties. This undermines the peace process and risks stoking tensions, as noted by the representative of the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission in his statement. Lastly, France notes that the African Union, the RGMEC, and the report of the Secretary General all underscore that major questions remain over the elections, including funding, reforms, and security. Any election must be able to be free, equitable, and transparent, in line with international standards and the revitalized peace agreement. In this respect, France calls upon the South Sudanese transition government to allocate the resources necessary for the drafting of a constitution, for a census, and for the unification of the security forces. Madam President, the coming months will be crucial for the future of South Sudan. The South Sudanese transition government, as well as the other parties to the revitalized peace agreement, must live up to their responsibilities and fully implement the 2018 agreement. France stands alongside the South Sudanese people to support the peace process. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I also want to thank Special Representative Gubeho, Chairperson Owino, and Ms. Rizik for their briefings, and also welcome the participation of the representative of South Sudan. As we've heard today, ongoing violence continues to displace civilians and to deepen an already acute humanitarian crisis. Women and girls continue to bear the brunt, including through conflict-related sexual violence. First, the United Kingdom reiterates the urgent need for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a return to the political process. We urge all parties to use this immediate period to engage in genuine and inclusive dialogue. We welcome the work of the AU Special Envoy, President Kikate, and the close cooperation between the UN, the AU, and IGAD in support of peace and dialogue. Second, any elections must strengthen, not undermine peace and stability. The South Sudanese people should be able to choose their representatives and hold them to account. But this can only happen through elections that are credible, peaceful, and inclusive, or they risk a return to conflict. That means the conditions envisioned in the 2018 peace agreement must be in place, including sufficient political space, security, and inclusive participation. An election in which major parties cannot participate freely would serve neither democracy nor peace. Third, public resources must be managed responsibly, transparently, and in the interests of the South Sudanese people. Essential services remain severely unfunded, and the consequences are felt most acutely by ordinary South Sudanese. Just 2% of the national budget is currently spent on health and education. But functioning services, particularly healthcare, are increasingly critical as the risk grows of Ebola spreading into South Sudan. Finally, UNMISS continues to play a critical role in supporting peace and stability. The mission provides a vital source of protection and support, helping to prevent and respond to intercommunal violence, maintaining a protective presence in areas at risk of conflict, facilitating humanitarian assistance, and supporting vital dialogue between communities. We call on the transitional government of South Sudan to cooperate fully with the mission and to ensure it can carry out its mandate freely and without obstruction. President, the people of South Sudan deserve a future defined not by violence and instability, but by peace, dignity, and accountable governance. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Denmark. I thank all our briefers for this morning and welcome the representative of South Sudan to this meeting. Denmark shares the concern expressed by the briefers and other council members on the deterioration of the political and humanitarian situation in South Sudan. We believe that the revitalized peace agreement remains the only viable framework for a peaceful political transition in South Sudan. Its full implementation is essential to preserve peace and prevent a return to widespread conflict. We stress that any election must be transparent, free and fair, and we strongly urge that it is preceded by a credible inter-party dialogue, including the armed factions of the opposition. Furthermore, we echo the African Union's calls for the release of First Vice President Machar and other figures in opposition parties. Denmark supports regional initiatives, including the AU High-Level Ad Hoc Committee, the efforts of the AU High Representative for the Horn of Africa, and IGAD. We call for strong alignment between all initiatives. We further echo the call by Ms. Rizek to ensure the participation of South Sudanese women and women's civil society organizations in all aspects of the transitional process. Second, we're deeply concerned by dire humanitarian situation across the country, as well as the security implications stemming from the prolonged conflict in Sudan, including movement of fighters and arms across the border. Refugee flows into South Sudan further strain an already overstretched humanitarian response. The risk of famine, as highlighted in the recent IPC report, is also increasing in several areas, including Jonglei and Upper Nile states. As we have heard, in situations of hunger and famine, women are more vulnerable, often facing increased risk of gender-based violence. All parties must comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law and allow unfettered access to humanitarian actors. Third, UNMISS continues to be a key pillar of stability and security in South Sudan. We express our full support to the mission and its mandated tasks, including protection of civilians, but also its good offices, which remain important. However, the mission must be enabled and resourced to operate effectively. We condemn continued violations of the Status of Forces Agreement, the consequences of which are ultimately borne by the people of South Sudan. In closing, the people of South Sudan have waited too long for the promises of the peace agreement to be fulfilled by their leaders. Denmark will continue to support regional efforts and UNMISS in advancing peace, protecting civilians, and creating the conditions for a credible and inclusive political transition. I now resume my functions as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of South Sudan.
Madam President, briefers, the chairperson of RGMAC, and Ms. Lillian for their input. South Sudan welcomes the report of the Secretary General as part of UNMISS regular reporting responsibilities and appreciates the mission's continued engagement with my government. At the same time, we encourage future reports to remain firmly grounded on verified facts and balanced analysis, avoiding based on sources whose objectivity may reasonably be questioned. Madam President, looking at this report, one issue strikingly deserved particular attention. The report repeatedly describes organized armed groups simply as armed youth. This terminology does not accurately reflect the security realities on the ground. We recall that in its press statements of 21st March 2025, responding to the Nasser incident, this council unequivocally condemned attack by the White Army against UNMISS. It is therefore important that UN reporting remains consistent and accurately identify organized armed groups whenever credible evidence permits. Precision in language promotes accountability and informed decision making. The report also seems to insinuate or to be attempting to characterize recent adjustment relating to the revitalized peace agreement as unilateral. South Sudan respectfully disagrees on such assertions. These measures were undertaken within the framework of the agreement to advance implementation after prolonged delays. The temporary absence of certain leaders, whether by choice or because they are subject to legal process, cannot indefinitely suspend implementation of an agreement intended to benefit the entire nation. The parties remain represented through their duly designated members in accordance with the agreements. Madam President, sorry. We have taken note also of concerns expressed regarding the first Vice President. South Sudan remains committed to the rule of law and to ensuring that all legal processes are conducted in accordance with the Constitution and application of law. No individual, irrespective of political positions or public office, should be considered above the law. Just as every individual is entitled to due process and guaranteed afforded by law under our legal system. We therefore encourage respect for the independence of the competent national institutions responsible for addressing matters that are before them. Madam President, South Sudan acknowledges the concerns expressed regarding preparation for elections. While challenges remain, we are confident that they are manageable through continued national efforts and cooperation with our regional and international partners. The principal obstacles are well known. Continued insecurity caused by armed groups, severe economic constraints exacerbated by the sanction regimes, and the need for greater clarity regarding the benchmarks for lifting those measures. We also wish to underscore that routine government or governmental decisions undertaken within constitutional and legal frameworks are sovereign responsibilities. Such actions should not be interpreted as a departure from peace process. Regarding electoral preparation, we assure this august House that our determination to let the people of South Sudan decide the leaders has never been greater. Concerns such as the national census or other related topics such as the permanent constitution will clearly be conducted when time permits. We are fully aware that the national census, which is very important for long-term planning, is not a prerequisite for election and could not hold such an important process hostage. We maintain that the essential requirement for election is a credible voter register. Our own independence referendum demonstrates that democratic choices can be exercised without an immediate prior census to that particular purpose. Madam President, South Sudan remains firmly committed to peace, dialogue, and full implementation of the revitalized peace agreement. At the same time, every sovereign government has responsibility to uphold constitutional order and protect its citizens against those who resort to violence. As regards the mission's delivery of its mandate and allegations of violations littering the report, we reassure this Council that our stance on these issues is clear and steadfast. None of these alleged violations is a policy of the government. And if there were situations where the mission was advised against advancing towards certain areas, these were done in support of the missions and in our drive to safeguard the safety of their personnel and equipment. Others could be attributed to lack of capacity and experience of individuals executing them. And this again is a result of the country being subjected to measures that hinder it from properly equipping its human resources and personnel. Sanctions. Under no circumstances should this be termed as government-derived hindrances. As for those happening outside the areas under the control of the government or under the control of the opposition entities, those cannot be bluntly reported against the government of South Sudan. Finally, my government reaffirmed its commitment to constructive cooperation with UNMISS, with the United Nations in general, with the African Union and with IGAD, and all partners in advancing lasting peace, democratic governance, and sustainable development. The people of South Sudan deserve peace, stability, and opportunity to determine their future through democratic means. That remains our unwavering commitment. I thank you.
I thank the representative of South Sudan for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on this subject. The meeting is adjourned.